Hello, everyone. I'm coming back with you with a few more paragraphs in this wonderful, enlightening, very needed read book. I just read the prefix. Now I'm going to read the introduction. A question of survival. When the decade of the 1970s began, the United States government was officially but unconstitutionally in the midst of two wars: the war of attrition, genocide, against the colonized colored people of Indochina, and an expeditionary law and order campaign, repressive selective genocide, against the colonized colored people of the United States. Although non alienated, both colonized groups had much in common, as discussed in part two. They were, in fact, victims of the same war, through in different theaters. Excuse me. In the United States, as in Indochina, victims of these undeclared wars painfully achieved high visibility during the 1960s. The colonized blacks inside the United States were the subject of numerous and extensive studies, special programs, White House conferences, and plain gawking curiosity. Occasionally, a collection of what American society regarded as social antiques would present themselves for inspection in the nation's capital. Such a group arrived in the spring of 1966. A motley collection of black poor, they were spectacle even for the Lafayette Park, where they spent the night, rest broken, poorly clothed, and shivering, the 2 dozen Mississippi outcasts could not have been less in tune with the opulence around them. Some still crowded inside and others huddled outside the several tents that had pitched in the park across Pennsylvania Avenue, squarely in front of the White House. These uninvited campers had braved a bone chilling mist that shrouded the park. 2 years earlier, some of them had dared vote in the presidential election for the first time in their many adult years. Others were accused of participating in the Meredith March Against Fear, a walk quickly interrupted by the blast of a white man's shotgun that nearly took the life of James Meredith. Some of them might even have joined in the chorus along the Meredith March that gave the first audible shouts of Black Power. They kept explaining that they were not the Negroes who had lived in at the deactivated Greenville, Mississippi Air Force Base and were finally dragged out by the military. Instead, they insisted they had relied on the people in Washington to help them work out their needs in an orderly way. All of them had outlived their rights as tenants in the Mississippi feudal system, but they had not outlived their faith in the government. They had been evicted from the land. They had worked as sharecroppers, but they still allowed that the failing might be theirs, that it must have been they who have not made clear that their need was great and their cause just. They hoped that federal anti-poverty funds could be arranged for them to build houses and stay in the Delta, for that was home. Paper appeals failing, They brought their bodies to Washington, support their cause, and demonstrate their need. The bureaucratic charades had reduced them to this tent-setting spectacle, a desperate effort to get the attention of President Lyndon B. Johnson and possibly embarrass him into action on their behalf. The Washington Post that morning carried a story of the telegram that they sent to the president. It was signed "Your Neighbors." Their humor was lost on the president. There was no neighborly response. There was no response at all. In time, they were driven by harsh weather and dysentery back, hungry and homeless, to the rigors of survival in the Mississippi Delta. The spectacle of Lafayette Park kept alive the symbolic depravity of the inhuman history. Those anguished inhabitants of the park were truly a dying people. So were their legions of millions left in the valley of the Black Belt and in the teeming ghettos of Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and all the other welfare swelled urban centers of the East, North, and West. They were obsolete people, described by the then Labor Secretary W. Willard Works as a human scrap heap. This is how they talk about us. We just heard an audio of Ronald Reagan calling our black leaders monkeys. No telling how they talk about us when they think that they're not being recorded. Oh, they're being recorded, but see, some of these recordings are not going to come out way after they're dead, or some of us is dead, and we've been admiring these people. Didn't come out 5 years after we gone. They was talking about us like a dog all the time. So this is what the Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz said. We are piling up a human scrap heap of between 250,000 and 500,000 people a year, many of whom never appear in the unemployment statistics. What is they doing about it? Let's find out. They are often not counted among the unemployed because they have given up looking for work and thus count themselves out of the labor market. The rate of non-participation in the labor force by men in their prime years increased from 4.7% in 1953 to 5.2% in 1962. The increase has been the sharpest among non-whites, increasing from 5.3% to 8.2% in that period. The human scrap heap is composed of persons who, as a consequence of technological development, of their own educational failures, of environments of poverty, and often cause that disqualify them for employment in a skilled economic, cannot and will not find work without special help. The 115,000 boys who failed the Selective Service Educational Test in 1963 are candidates for the human scrap heap. If we are to turn the human scrap heap into materials for richer progress and more rewarding lives, then private industry and our private institution must help us to do the job that government actions have only suggested needed doing. Didn't sound like much help. A people whom the society had always denied social value, personality, had also lost economic value. Theirs was the problem of all Black American survival. Examination of the problem must begin with single overpowering so, society socio-economic condition in the society. Black Americans are obsolete people. While this certainly is not accurate in a moral sense, nor at the moment biologically, it is true where, in the 1970s, it becomes the issue. It is true in the minds and schemes of those who, with inordinated power and authority, control the nation. While it may not be true among the general population, mass sentiments against oppression and possible genocide are not sufficiently strong to cause these schemes to fail. Black Americans have outlived their usefulness. Their raison to this society has ceased to be a compelling issue. Once the economic excess, they are now considered an economic drag. The wood is all hewn, the water all drawn, the cotton all picked, and the rails reach from coast to coast. The ditches are all dug, the dishes are put away, and only a few shoes remain to be shined. Thanks to old black backs and new frail machines, the sweat cores of the nation are done. Now, the sum of 25 million blacks face a society that is brutally pragmatic, technologically accomplished, deeply racist, increasingly overcrowded, and surely in such a society, the absence of social and economic value is a crucial factor in anyone's fight for a future. Blacks in America have 250 years of nationally sanctioned slavery and another 100 years of deceitful enslavement outside national law. Now they are irreconcilably committed to personal dignity and justice to a people. Their patience, like the ox cart, is gone. But the hope remains that they, unlike the oxen, can cease to be driven and can be permitted to say, on human and civil terms. They want to survive, but only as men and women, no longer as pawns and chattel. Can they? This is the most frightful and pressing question facing America in the 1970s. Those who say the most urgent questions is the environment should recognize that it is the blackness that is unsightly in America. Those who say it is war should face the fact that racism, a arrogance of superiority that seeks economic and military exploitation, is much the nation's role in Birmingham as it is in Vietnam. And those who say that the most pressing issue is law and order should recognize the term for what it is: a euphemism for the total repression and possible extermination of those in the society who cry for justice where little justice can be found. Whether blacks have a place in U.S. society is a choice that belongs to the nation. That choice was audaciously called to the attention of white America early in 1960 when four black college students sat down at a North Carolina lunch counter reserved for whites. For the 10 raw years of 1960, the nation noisily grappled with its choice: freedom or death for Afro Americans. By the end of the decade, blacks were forced to face the evidence heaped painfully upon them. The evidence showed that a choice had been made and freedom was denied. True, the decade of 1960 provided some contrary indications. There were, for example, outpourings of new laws and pronouncements that ostensibly guaranteed not only freedom and security, but also socio-economic progress. Blacks were visibly appointed to a handful of high federal positions. This was a kind of progress, but it was also confusing. It helped obscure for many blacks and whites alike the true dangers being designed by repressive elements. In significant instances, what appears to be progress was in fact the vehicle of the danger itself. For example, black appointees to high office generally included men of some standing and or credibility in the black communities. Without that fact, of course, the value of the appointment was greatly, if not totally, diminished. Appointees included such men as Robert C. Weaver as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the first non white member of the President's Cabinet, Andrew Brenner, the first black governor of the Federal Reserve Board, Leslie C. Carter Jr. as Assistant Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Theodore M. Berry as a Community Action Director of the Office of Economic Appointment, and Thurgood Marshall as a Solicitor General, then Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, both unprecedented. Now, we're talking the 60s before we even got this kind of um, theater that you have these black people in high official business positions in the president's cabinet. Now, while the black appointees were highly visible, they were, for the most part, powerless. And their powerless visibility in and around the bureaucratic councils added a aurora of legitimacy to illegitimate acts, providing a smokescreen for dirty dealing. This is neither a criticized nor exonerated the appointees. The fault was not theirs. The fault was in the system by design. Those who attribute the major fault to the appointees do so mainly out of their failure to grasp the cleverness and ruthlessness in the bureaucratic, bureaucratic design to which these men were attached. This is not to say that those who hope should not have hoped, and that those who tried should have done otherwise. When the 1960 decade began, there was every reason both to hope and to try. This cycle of hope, lost hope, promise, aborted promise, then ranked oppression began with the election in 1960 of Senator John F. Kennedy to the presidency. What with the Freedom Riders in full swing and with black people singing a bold new song, what real choice had black people between candidate Richard M. Nixon, who had authored concentration camp legislation, and a suburbly glamorous young man who promised to get America moving again? When President Kennedy brought into the White House Andrew Hatcher, the first black White House assistant press secretary. That appointment served to indicate that he was willing to hear the black man's story. Subsequently, he received at the White House the leaders of a massive 1963 march on Washington for jobs and freedom. He promised those leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young Jr., Roy Wilkins, and John Lewis, a new strategy to attack poverty and injustice. Less than 4 months later, President Kennedy was dead, and the decade's first brief hope and promise had died with him. New hope and bigger promises nonetheless sprang up in their places. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, offered his sequel to President Kennedy's Let Us Begin, said President Johnson, let us continue. The Johnson Promise, the Great Society. Within a few months after President Kennedy was shot down in Dallas, November the 22nd, 1963, President Johnson announced a new unconditional war on poverty and succeeded in getting an aggrieved Congress to pass the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, signed on July the 2nd, and to create on August the 20th the Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO. Beyond that, President Johnson made highly publicized speeches pledging to open doors for poor blacks and to help them walk through those doors into a great society. Those were the promises of the Great Society. The floods of government promise and black hope both crested at that point in the 1960s. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the glint began to wear from Uncle Sam's shiny new armor. It tarnished even the Uncle Sam stood like a colossus in the middle of the poverty and civil rights battlefield, swearing to take on all comers on behalf of Negroes and the poor. Still, early in the new day of hope, weary Negroes strained to see some sign of battle, could not perceive the perilous that stayed the federal giant. But as the days wore on, the slow motions of the federal giant did not match the fast, rhythmic rhetoric. In time, Negroes began to know what they heard was aimed at them, not for them. The cruelest hoax since the vain promise of 20 acres and a mule following the Civil War had been set in motion against Africans transplanted in America. The raised hand of Uncle Sam was swatting poor Negroes while rewarding bright, rich whites with the spoils of black misery. As the truth became known, hope turned to hatred, dedication became discussed, hands raised for the help became clenched fists, and eyes searching for acceptance toward turned inward. Negroes turned black. Blacks could see clearer what Negroes could not. If help would come, they themselves would bring it. Beauty was where they found it. Finding beauty meant being beautiful. They could win only if the system lost, and vice versa. And what truly was at stake was their natural lives. And so it went. A decade of freedom rides, promises, public con games, black rebellions, and armed invasions of campus sanctuaries. Even so, through it all, blacks did manage more togetherness, whether it was in Vietnam or campsites on this side, the college campus, or at the wakes for the martyrs in jail cells, or in OEO community action boards. The Black togetherness of the 1960s, the newfound Blackness, produced a new visibility and grip on the issues affecting Black lives. Consequently, through a residue of confidence in the political system, hundreds of Blacks were elected to public office. But even some of them foresaw, as the new decade began, concentration camps and oppression. Thus, even the Blacks who hoped most and were most rewarded in the tradition of the system saw it in the nation's choice a clear and present danger. The schemes of the 1970s promised new martyrs, bigger jails, more wars at home and abroad, data banks, wiretaps, and genuinely regimented society, including the sharp curlement of Black college students, a white establishment takeover of Black colleges, the psychology barbed wire around all learning institutions. In short, the 1970s promised a reversal of those processes that, in the 1960s, tended to bring Black people a modicum of so-called society and economic advancement. In the 1970s, the Black Americans, it is clearly a question of survival. The choice. No wonder we don't know we're going through this. Because when all this was happening, a lot of our parents was not taking heed, was not paying attention. Um, the government somewhat threw a rock and separated us. That's when we started becoming Blacks versus niggers. Okay. Now they kind of got away from the field hand and the house the house nigger and the field nigger, brought about the Blacks versus the niggers because they gave certain Blacks real good jobs working in these factories, making all this good money. And then the rest of us, we couldn't go work at the offices. So we were stuck digging the ditches, picking the beans and the cotton. And so these ones that was making all this good money, they started looking down at us. But they forgot about that man up on the hill. You still a nigger. You just but I was a product of that. I had parents that was part of that get rich scheme that blinded us. Instead of staying true to yourself and to your people, they began to, keep up with the Joneses, wanted to look real good, wanted to buy all the fancy stuff, the house, the Cadillac, and then they began to cheat on one another. I was part of that where they had all this money, so they had money to afford an outside family too. And, uh, you know, and they stayed together because that money was good, but the family home was terrible. I didn't even know it was a race problem. I didn't even know because where I live, everybody got along. So everybody have a wonderful time. I'm gonna leave so I can answer this phone call. Peace out.